The book of Acts tells the story of the early church. It is a fascinating account of how the followers of Jesus began to spread his teachings and establish communities of believers. The book is filled with miraculous events, powerful sermons, and the unwavering faith of the early Christians. One of the most amazing events described in the book of Acts happened in Jerusalem. This city, with its rich history and spiritual significance, was the backdrop for a moment that would change the course of history. This event is called Pentecost. It is celebrated by Christians around the world as the day when the Holy Spirit descended upon the apostles. Pentecost took place 50 days after Jesus rose from the dead. This period of 50 days is significant in Jewish tradition as well, marking the time between Passover and the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot. On that day, the followers of Jesus were gathered together. They were likely praying and reflecting on the teachings of Jesus, as they often did. Suddenly, there was a sound from heaven. It was not an ordinary sound, but something extraordinary and divine. It sounded like a strong wind blowing. This was no gentle breeze, but a powerful rushing wind that filled the air with its intensity. The sound filled the whole house where they were sitting. The followers of Jesus were astonished and filled with awe at this incredible phenomenon. Then, something even more amazing happened. As they looked around in wonder, they saw a sight that would leave a lasting impression on their hearts and minds. The followers saw what looked like tongues of fire. These flames were not consuming or destructive, but rather a symbol of divine presence and power. These tongues of fire rested on each one of them. It was a personal and individual experience for every person in the room. Immediately, they were filled with the Holy Spirit. This was a transformative moment, filling them with joy, courage, and a sense of purpose. They began to speak in other languages. This was not just a random occurrence, but a miraculous sign of the Holy Spirit's power. They spoke languages they had never learned before. This enabled them to communicate the message of Jesus to people from different regions and cultures.
This event was very important. It was a pivotal moment in the history of the Christian church. It marked the beginning of the Christian church. From this point on, the followers of Jesus were empowered to spread his teachings far and wide. The Holy Spirit came down to empower Jesus' followers. This divine empowerment gave them the strength and courage to face challenges and opposition. They were given the ability to share the good news about Jesus. This was not just a message for a select few, but for all people, regardless of their background or language. They could now share this news with people from different countries and languages. This marked the beginning of the global mission of the Christian church.
The story of Pentecost is found in the Bible, in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. These verses describe the events of that day in vivid detail. This event showed the power of God. It was a clear demonstration of God's presence and action in the world. It showed that God was with the early Christians. They were not alone in their mission, but had the support and guidance of the Holy Spirit. God gave them the ability to do amazing things. They performed miracles, healed the sick, and spoke with wisdom and authority. They were able to take the message of Jesus to the whole world. This was the beginning of a movement that would grow and spread across continents and generations, bringing hope and transformation to countless lives. The miracle at Pentecost involved both real fire and real languages. It was a momentous event that marked the birth of the early church and showcased the divine power in a tangible way. The Bible tells us that tongues of fire rested on each disciple. These flames were not just symbolic, they were a visible manifestation of the Holy Spirit descending upon the followers of Jesus. This symbolized the presence of the Holy Spirit. The fire represented purity, power, and the transformative energy of God's Spirit working within them. The Holy Spirit was giving them special power and ability. This empowerment was crucial for the mission that lay ahead, as the disciples were tasked with spreading the gospel to all nations. The disciples then spoke in other languages. This was not a random occurrence. It was a deliberate act of divine intervention to ensure that the message of Jesus could reach a diverse audience. These were real human languages. The disciples were suddenly able to speak fluently in languages they had never learned, breaking down barriers of communication. The people who heard them were amazed. They couldn't believe their ears as they heard their own native tongues being spoken by Galileans. They were visitors to Jerusalem from many different nations. These visitors had come for the Feast of Pentecost, a major Jewish festival, and were now witnessing something extraordinary. Each person heard the disciples speaking in their own native language. This was a clear sign that the message of Jesus was meant for everyone, regardless of their background or nationality. This gift of tongues had a very specific purpose. It was not just a display of divine power, but a practical tool for evangelism. It allowed the disciples to communicate the gospel message clearly. The language barrier was no longer an obstacle, and the good news could be shared effectively. People from all over the world could understand the good news about Jesus. This inclusivity was a cornerstone of the early Christian message, emphasizing that salvation was available to all. This was a powerful demonstration of God's power. It was a miraculous event that left no doubt about the divine origin of the message being preached. It showed that the gospel was for everyone. The miracle of Pentecost broke down social and cultural barriers, uniting people in a shared spiritual experience. The gift of tongues was a supernatural ability. It was a clear indication that the disciples were operating under divine influence, guided by the Holy Spirit. It was a gift from the Holy Spirit. This gift was not earned or learned. It was freely given to empower the disciples for their mission. It was not something that the disciples learned or practiced on their own. This divine ability was a direct result of their connection with the Holy Spirit. It was a sign that God was at work in a powerful way. The miracle of Pentecost was a clear indication that the early church was under divine guidance and that God's plan was unfolding in a remarkable manner. The Apostle Paul wrote extensively about spiritual gifts in his letters to the early Christian communities. His teachings were aimed at guiding believers on how to use these gifts effectively and harmoniously within the church. One of these significant letters was addressed to the Corinthian church, a community known for its diversity and spiritual enthusiasm. The Corinthians were eager to express their newfound faith, but this sometimes led to disorder during their gatherings. In his letter, Paul explained that speaking in tongues was indeed a genuine gift from the Holy Spirit. This gift allowed individuals to speak in languages they had never learned, serving as a sign of God's power and presence. However, Paul also emphasized the importance of order and purpose in using this gift. He was concerned that the misuse of tongues could lead to confusion and division within the church.
Paul taught that all spiritual gifts, including tongues, were given for the common good. They were not meant to elevate the individual, but to serve and strengthen the entire community of believers. These gifts were meant to build up the church and glorify God. Paul wanted the Corinthians to understand that the ultimate goal of any spiritual gift was to contribute to the unity and growth of the church. He stressed that when the church met together, everything should be done decently and in order. This principle was crucial for maintaining harmony and ensuring that the worship services were edifying for everyone present.
In his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 14, Paul provided specific guidelines for the use of tongues in the church. He instructed that if anyone spoke in a tongue, there should be someone to interpret, so that the entire congregation could benefit from the message. He urged believers to desire the gift of prophecy more than the gift of tongues. Prophecy, Paul explained, was more beneficial for building up the entire church because it involved speaking God's message in a language everyone could understand. Prophecy allowed for clear communication of divine truths, which could instruct, encourage, and comfort the believers. This made it a more practical and edifying gift for the church's communal worship. Paul's teachings make it clear that while speaking in tongues was a valid gift of the Spirit, it was not meant to be disruptive or to draw attention to the speaker. Instead, it was to be used in a way that edified the church and honored God. By emphasizing order and purpose, Paul sought to ensure that the spiritual gifts would contribute to the church's mission and reflect the character of God. His instructions remain relevant today, reminding us that our gifts are to be used with love, humility, and a focus on the greater good of the community. Section 4. The Gift of Languages. A sign for unbelievers. In the book of Acts, the gift of tongues often served as a sign for unbelievers. When the disciples spoke in other languages, it attracted attention and sparked curiosity. It showed that something supernatural was happening. For example, on the day of Pentecost, the crowd was amazed. They heard the disciples speaking in their own languages. This miraculous event prepared their hearts to hear Peter's message. Some scholars believe that the primary purpose of tongues was to serve as a sign for unbelievers. They point to instances in the book of Acts where tongues played this role. They argued that this gift was especially important in the early church. It helped to spread the gospel rapidly in a time when communication was limited. However, others argue that the sign gifts, including tongues, were primarily meant for the early church. They believed that these gifts were less common as the New Testament canon was completed and the church became more established. Section 5. Tongues Today, the Continuationist View. The debate about speaking in tongues continues today. There are two main viewpoints within Christianity. One group believes that the gift of tongues is still active today. They are called continuationists.
Continuationists believe that the miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit, including tongues, continue to operate within the church. They point to modern-day experiences of speaking in tongues as evidence. They believe that these experiences are genuine manifestations of the Holy Spirit.
They often emphasize the role of the Holy Spirit in empowering believers for ministry and evangelism. They see speaking in tongues as a way to deepen personal prayer life and receive spiritual edification. Some continuationist denominations encourage speaking in tongues during worship services.
Continuationists believe that the same power that was available to the early church is still available today. They encourage believers to earnestly desire the gifts of the Spirit. They believe that these gifts are given for the building up of the church and the advancement of God's kingdom.